The little boy's screams echoed outside the hospital doors as doctor after doctor walked past him. Through the crowd, only a small, dirty hand reached out to help, a hand that would unknowingly touch billions of dollars. But no one could predict what was watching from the shadows. Where are you watching this incredible story from? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more life-changing tales. The waiting room at St. Mary's Hospital in Boston was packed that Tuesday morning. Rain pounded against the windows as if demanding entry, mirroring the desperate cries of 2-year-old Noah Evans. The toddler's face had turned crimson from screaming, tears streaming down his chubby cheeks as he pulled frantically at his ears. His grandfather, Charles Evans, a distinguished man in his 70s with silver hair and a tailored suit that screamed old money, clutched the boy's tiny hand. "Please, someone, my grandson needs help." Charles called out, his voice cracking with desperation. "He hasn't stopped crying for 3 days." The receptionist barely glanced up. "Sir, we've told you that Dr. Whitman is on vacation. The earliest appointment we can give you is next Thursday. That's 9 days away. Look at him." Charles snapped, gesturing to Noah, whose screams had intensified. "I understand, sir, but unless it's a life-threatening emergency, his hearing aids malfunctioned. He can't hear anything, and he's in pain." Charles's voice boomed across the waiting room. "We've been to 4 hospitals already." Other patients shifted uncomfortably. A young intern approached, glanced at Noah, and shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. Pediatric audiology is specialized, without Dr. Whitman." "So you're saying no doctor in this entire hospital can look at a 2-year-old's ears?" Charles's voice dripped with the acid of privilege denied. The intern's face hardened. "Sir, we have protocols." "Protocols?" Charles laughed bitterly. "I could buy this entire hospital before lunchtime." The threat hung in the air, causing several heads to turn. The Evans name was legendary in Boston's financial district, a dynasty built on investments dating back 3 generations. What they couldn't know was that Charles wasn't exaggerating. His net worth exceeded $2 billion. "Grandfather," a soft voice called from behind. "Let's try somewhere else." Elizabeth, Charles's 25-year-old granddaughter, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her eyes, the same striking blue as Noah's, held a calm that contrasted sharply with her grandfather's fury. "We've tried 5 hospitals, Lizzie," Charles whispered, suddenly deflated. 5. They all say the same thing." "Then we'll try a 6th, Elizabeth said firmly, lifting Noah into her arms. "Come on, little man." "Ah." As they stepped outside into the downpour, Noah's screams competed with the thunder. Elizabeth's expensive designer coat was soon soaked through, but she barely noticed as she shielded her nephew with her body. "Maybe we should just call Dr. Reichman in Switzerland," she suggested, referencing their family's private physician. Charles nodded grimly. "I'll have the jet readied." Neither noticed the small figure huddled under the hospital's concrete awning, watching them with eyes that had seen too much for their 8 years. "Sometimes the doctors don't listen because they're too busy counting their money," the little girl muttered, just loud enough for Elizabeth to hear. "My mom used to say that." Elizabeth turned, startled by the tiny voice. The girl was small, painfully thin, with matted dark hair and clothes that hung from her frame in damp, dirty layers. "Where is your mother now?" Elizabeth asked gently. The girl's eyes darkened. "Heaven," she replied with a simplicity that broke Elizabeth's heart. "But she taught me things before she left." The rain had let up slightly, transitioning from torrential to merely miserable. Charles Evans glanced at his Patek Philippe watch impatiently, then at the bedraggled child standing before them. "Elizabeth," he said tersely, "we need to get Noah to the airport. The jet will be ready in 40 minutes. But Elizabeth couldn't tear her eyes away from the small girl, who was now studying Noah with an intensity that belied her years. "What's your name?" Elizabeth asked. "Melody," the girl replied, her voice surprisingly clear and confident. His ears hurt bad, huh? Noah had momentarily quieted, his sobs reduced to hiccuping breaths as he studied the strange girl with teary eyes. Yes, Elizabeth answered, surprised. How did you know? Melody shrugged. He keeps touching them. My mom was a nurse before she got sick. She showed me stuff. Charles made a dismissive noise. Elizabeth, please. This child is homeless. We need medical professionals, not what, grandfather? Elizabeth challenged, a rare defiance in her voice. Not someone who's actually willing to help. Before Charles could respond, Melody had already moved closer to Noah. Can I see? She asked, directing the question to the boy rather than the adults. Noah, who couldn't hear her words, nevertheless seemed to understand her intention. He watched her warily, but didn't pull away when she gently touched his arm. Melody, where do you stay? Elizabeth asked quietly, as the girl examined Noah's ears from a respectful distance. Different places, Melody replied vaguely. The shelter on 3rd when it's really cold, but they don't let kids stay alone, so I have to pretend I'm with someone. Charles's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. For a man who prided himself on emotional control, the slight softening around his eyes spoke volumes. How long have you been on your own? He asked, his tone gentler now. 1 year, 2 months, and 11 days, Melody answered promptly, as if she'd been counting each one. Something in her matter-of-fact delivery struck Charles like a physical blow. This child, this tiny scrap of humanity, had been surviving alone on Boston streets while he'd been moving billions with the press of a button. The problem is inside, Melody said suddenly, returning her attention to Noah. Sometimes water gets trapped and turns bad. That's what my mom called an infection. Yes, that's what the doctors said at the first hospital, Elizabeth confirmed, but they said they couldn't see a specialist for weeks. Melody rolled her eyes with all the disdain of someone far beyond her years. Doctors sometimes can't see what's right in front of their fancy degrees. The acid in her childish voice made even Charles's lips twitch upward. There's mud over there. Melody pointed to a flower bed near the hospital entrance. My mom used to make poultices with special clay, but when we couldn't get that, she said clean mud works too, draws out the bad stuff. Absolutely not, Charles interjected, finally finding his voice. We are not putting mud in my grandson's ears. That's primitive, disgusting, beneath your billionaire standards. Melody fired back, and both Evan's adults stared in shock at her perception. Yeah, well, being deaf forever is probably worse. A small crowd had gathered, watching the strange tableau, the elegantly dressed elderly man, the fashionable young woman, the sobbing toddler, and the homeless child standing her ground like David before Goliath. How did you know we have money? Elizabeth asked softly. Melody pointed to Charles's watch. That costs more than a house. I'm 8, not stupid. For the first time in decades, Charles Evans found himself speechless. Elizabeth, however, was already moving toward the flower bed. Show me, she said simply. The mud was cool and slightly gritty between Elizabeth's manicured fingers. She watched with equal parts fascination and trepidation as Melody expertly mixed it with a little rainwater from a puddle, creating a thick paste. It needs to be smooth, Melody explained, her small hands working with surprising dexterity. No stones or sticks. Those could hurt him. From the sidelines, Charles observed with visible distaste. Elizabeth, this is absurd. We could be halfway to the airfield by now. And yet Noah would still be screaming in pain, Elizabeth countered, not looking up from Melody's improvised medicine. Noah had grown curious about the mud mixture, his tears momentarily forgotten as he watched the girl work. When she finally approached him with a small dab of the earthy paste, he didn't pull away. It's okay, Melody soothed, though Noah couldn't hear her words. This won't hurt. Promise. And gee, With gentle movements that belied her young age, Melody applied a thin layer of mud around the outside of Noah's ear, careful not to push any inside. "The clay pulls out infection," she explained to Elizabeth. "My mum used to tell me it's like a magnet for the bad stuff." "Your mother taught you well," Elizabeth said softly. A fleeting shadow crossed Melody's face. She was smart, real smart, not like those doctors who wouldn't help you. Noah remained remarkably still during the process. Whether from exhaustion or a strange trust in this little mud doctor, he allowed Melody to apply the mixture to both ears. "Now we wait," Melody said with the authority of a seasoned physician. 10 minutes, then we clean it off gentle." The unlikely group made a strange picture on the hospital bench. Wealth and poverty, side by side, united by a child's pain. Charles checked his phone periodically, firing off texts about delaying the private jet. Elizabeth kept her arm protectively around Noah, and Melody sat straight-backed, her eyes never leaving her patient. "You know," Charles finally broke the silence, "there are 289 licensed physicians in this hospital." His voice carried a bitterness that seemed to surprise even him, and not one could spare 5 minutes for a screaming child. Elizabeth finished his thought. "If you got money, you think throwing more at a problem fixes it," Melody observed sagely. "Sometimes you just need someone who cares enough to get their hands dirty." Charles's mouth twitched, somewhere between offense and reluctant amusement. "Quite the philosopher for someone who hasn't finished elementary school." "Haven't started it," Melody corrected. "Can't go to school without an address." The casual statement hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. "You've never been to school?" Melody shrugged. "Mom taught me to read before she got sick. I practice with newspapers, I find. And I'm good at counting money." Her tiny chest puffed with pride at this skill. Elizabeth exchanged a look with her grandfather, a silent communication passing between them. Charles gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Time to wash it off," Melody announced, breaking the moment. She gently led Noah to a nearby drinking fountain, where Elizabeth helped lift him up. With careful movements, Melody washed away the mud, using the edge of her worn sleeve as a towel. Noah blinked rapidly as the water trickled around his ears. Then, something remarkable happened. He giggled. "Water feels funny," he exclaimed, his voice loud but clear. Elizabeth gasped. "Noah, can you hear me?" The little boy turned, eyes wide with surprise. "Auntie Lizzie, not hurting now." Charles was on his feet instantly, moving with an agility that belied his 73 years. "Noah, say something else, my boy." "Grandpa Loud!" Noah laughed, covering his ears playfully rather than in pain. Elizabeth turned to Melody, tears welling in her eyes. "How did you—" But the girl wasn't looking at them. Her attention had shifted to a figure standing in the shadow of the hospital entrance, a tall man in a dark coat, watching them intently. "He's been there a while," Melody whispered, suddenly tense. "Watching us." The man in the shadows took a step forward, and Charles instinctively moved to place himself between the stranger and the children. The protective gesture wasn't lost on Elizabeth, who quickly gathered Noah into her arms. "Can I help you?" Charles's voice carried the authoritative edge that had intimidated boardroom opponents for decades. The man stepped fully into the light, revealing a weathered face with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He wore a simple jacket over scrubs, hospital attire, but not a doctor's white coat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent Elizabeth couldn't quite place. "I didn't mean to alarm you. I'm Alejandro Ruiz, a janitor here." He gestured to the hospital ID clipped to his pocket. "Why were you watching us?" Elizabeth asked, still wary. Alejandro's gaze shifted to Melody, who was half hidden behind Elizabeth now. "I've seen this young lady before, sleeping in the hospital waiting room on cold nights. Security usually chases her out. But He paused. "I bring her food sometimes." Melody relaxed slightly. "Mr. Ruiz is nice," she confirmed. "He gave me a blanket last winter." Charles studied the man with the shrewd assessment that had made him a formidable businessman. "You were watching how she helped my grandson." Alejandro nodded. "I was fascinated. What she did, it's an old remedy from my homeland in Guatemala. My grandmother was a curandera, a healer. She used clay poultices for ear infections too." Noah, now comfortable in Elizabeth's arms, pointed excitedly at his ears. "Not hurting. Girl fixed." "I see that," Alejandro smiled warmly at the boy. "It's quite remarkable." Charles cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the growing audience their little drama had attracted. Hospital staff and patients had gathered at a respectful distance, whispering among themselves. "Well, Mr. Ruiz, we're grateful for your kindness to—" Charles faltered, realizing he hadn't properly acknowledged their young savior. "Melody," Elizabeth supplied. "Her name is Melody." "Yes, Melody," Charles continued, awkwardly reaching into his pocket to extract his wallet. "And we'd like to compensate you both for your assistance today." "No." The word came simultaneously from both Alejandro and Melody, surprising everyone. "I didn't help for money," Melody said firmly, her chin tilted up in a gesture of dignity that seemed beyond her years. Alejandro nodded in agreement. "Neither did I, sir, though if I may be so bold." He hesitated, then continued. "This young lady needs more than money. She needs a home, schooling, stability." Charles stiffened, his expression closing off. "Yes, well, there are proper channels for such matters. Social services, foster care—" "Which have failed her for over a year," Elizabeth interjected sharply. She knelt down to Melody's level, meeting the girl's eyes directly. "Where will you sleep tonight, Melody?" The girl shrugged with practiced nonchalance that didn't quite mask her vulnerability. "The library stays open until 9. Then maybe the bus station. It's not too cold tonight." Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. Here was Noah, heir to billions, whose every comfort was assured from birth, and beside him stood Melody, equally deserving yet sleeping in bus stations. "That's not acceptable," Elizabeth said firmly, rising to her full height and turning to her grandfather. "We have 22 empty bedrooms in the Boston house alone." Charles's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the determined set of his granddaughter's jaw, the same expression his late wife had worn when she'd made up her mind about something important. "Elizabeth, we can't simply take a child off the street. There are laws, procedures." "Actually," Alejandro interjected gently, "I've been trying to help Melody navigate the system. Her mother died of cancer last year. There's no father in the picture, no known relatives. She's been falling through the cracks of an overburdened system." A tense silence fell over the group, broken only by Noah's cheerful babbling as he played with Elizabeth's necklace, blissfully unaware of the adult complications swirling around him. "Oh, for God's sake," Charles finally muttered, pulling out his phone. "Jeffrey, get me Congressman Williams on the line." "Yes, I'm aware it's his daughter's wedding day. Tell him it's about a child in need, and I'll double my contribution to his next campaign." He stepped away to complete the call, leaving Elizabeth with a smile tugging at her lips. "Is your grandfather really talking to a congressman?" Alejandro asked in disbelief. "Welcome to the Evans family circus," Elizabeth replied dryly, "where money talks and bureaucracy walks." "Is he really a billionaire?" Melody whispered, her eyes wide. Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, but as you so wisely pointed out, that doesn't always solve the important problems." Melody processed this information with a thoughtful expression. "Does that mean I get to sleep in a real bed tonight?" "That," Elizabeth said, watching her grandfather gesture emphatically into his phone, "and much more, I suspect." The Evans estate in Boston's exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood loomed like something from another century, which in fact it was. Built in 1878 by Charles's great-grandfather, the brownstone mansion occupied nearly half a city block, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes over the cobblestone street below. Melody stood frozen on the sidewalk, her small hand clutching Elizabeth's as she stared up at the imposing structure. "You live here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "One of the places," Elizabeth replied honestly. "We have homes in New York, London, and a few other cities too." Melody's grip tightened. "I've never been inside a house this big. What if I get lost?" Charles, who had been instructing his driver about the luggage, overheard and surprised everyone with a gentle chuckle. "I still get lost occasionally, and I've lived here for 7 decades. This small joke, so unexpected from the stern patriarch, seemed to ease some of Melody's tension. Noah, now recovered from his ordeal and full of energy, tugged impatiently at his grandfather's hand. "Home, Grandpa. Want to show Melody my trains." The group made their way up the granite steps, where the massive oak door swung open before they reached it. A dignified man in his 60s stood in the doorway, his posture impeccable. "Good afternoon, Mr. Evans, Miss Elizabeth, Master Noah," he greeted them formally, then raised an eyebrow slightly at the sight of Melody in her tattered clothes. "Whitfield, this is Melody," Charles said. "She'll be staying with us for a while." If the butler was surprised by this announcement, he gave no indication beyond a slight widening of his eyes. "Very good, sir. Shall I prepare the blue guest room?" "No, the rose room, I think," Elizabeth interjected. "It's next to Noah's nursery and gets the morning sun." Melody stepped tentatively into the foyer, her worn sneakers squeaking against the marble floor. The space was larger than any room she'd ever been in, with a ceiling that soared 2 stories above. A grand staircase curved elegantly upward, and crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across the walls. "Holy!" Melody caught herself just in time, substituting moly. Charles' mouth twitched. "Indeed." "Whitfield, could you ask Mrs. Peterson to draw a bath for our guest?" Elizabeth requested, "and perhaps find some of the clothes we keep for donations that might fit her for tonight?" "Of course, Miss Elizabeth." The butler's eyes lingered on Melody for a moment, and his formal demeanor softened slightly. "Would the young lady care for some hot chocolate while she waits?" Melody's eyes widened. "Real hot chocolate, not just hot water with the powder." "I assure you, miss, we use Belgian chocolate melted with cream and a touch of cinnamon," Whitfield replied with such seriousness that one might have thought he was discussing matters of national security. "Yes, please," Melody whispered, overwhelmed. As Whitfield disappeared to make arrangements, Noah tugged at Melody's sleeve. "Come see my room. I have lots of toys." Elizabeth smiled at the boy's excitement. "First, let's get Melody settled, Noah. She's had a long day." While the others moved deeper into the house, Charles remained in the foyer, phone in hand. "I need to make a few calls," he announced. "Legal matters to sort out." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the complexity of their impulsive decision. Temporary guardianship papers, emergency placement approval, background checks, all the red tape that would normally take months would need to be expedited. 2 hours later, Melody was nearly unrecognizable. Bathed, dressed in clean pajamas, slightly too large but soft as clouds, she'd exclaimed, and with her dark hair washed and combed, she sat at the kitchen table devouring her 3rd peanut butter sandwich. "When was the last time you ate properly?" Elizabeth asked gently, watching the girl's hollow cheeks already looking a shade less gaunt. Melody considered the question seriously. "Tuesday last week. The church on Commonwealth does a free dinner." Elizabeth felt that now familiar twist in her heart. "You won't go hungry here," she promised. Charles entered the kitchen, a rarity that caused even Mrs. Peterson, the cook, to raise her eyebrows. He seemed uncomfortable in the informal setting, but determined. "I've spoken with Judge Harrison," he announced without preamble. "Given the unusual circumstances, he's granted us emergency temporary guardianship while a more permanent solution is arranged." "Permanent solution," Elizabeth echoed, suddenly wary. You mean adoption? Charles's expression remained neutral. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Elizabeth. There are protocols. There you go with protocols again, Elizabeth interrupted, a edge to her voice. This isn't a corporate merger, grandfather. This is a child's life. Melody looked between them, sandwich forgotten. Does that mean I can stay? For real? Before Charles could respond, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Noah, dressed in dinosaur pajamas, rubbed his eyes sleepily. Melody, stay forever, he declared with the absolute certainty of a 2-year-old. She's my friend. Charles opened his mouth, closed it, then finally sighed. We'll see, Noah. For now, yes, Melody is staying. A shadow passed across the kitchen window. Perhaps a bird, perhaps just the wind moving branches against the glass. But for a brief moment, Melody tensed, her eyes darting to the darkness outside. What is it? Elizabeth asked, noticing the change. Melody shook her head slowly. Nothing, just sometimes I feel like someone's watching me. Ever since Mom died. Morning light streamed through the rose-colored curtains, casting a warm glow across the antique 4-poster bed where Melody lay curled beneath layers of down comforters. For several minutes after waking, she remained perfectly still, convinced that any movement might shatter what surely must be a dream. The bedroom was larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with her mother. A hand-painted ceiling mural depicted cherubs floating among fluffy clouds, and the furniture, all delicately carved wood with gilt accents, looked like it belonged in a museum. A soft knock at the door finally prompted her to sit up. "Come in," she called, her voice still thick with sleep. The door opened to reveal Elizabeth, already dressed in a simple but clearly expensive sweater and jeans. "Good morning," she smiled. "How did you sleep?" "I didn't wake up once," Melody marveled. "The bed doesn't even have lumps." Elizabeth's smile faltered slightly at this matter-of-fact observation. "Breakfast is ready whenever you are. No rush." As Elizabeth turned to leave, Melody blurted out the question that had kept resurfacing in her mind since yesterday. "Why are you doing this?" Elizabeth paused, her hand on the doorknob. "Doing what?" "Letting me stay here. Giving me food and this room and everything." Melody's dark eyes were serious beyond her years. "Nobody does something for nothing." The cynicism in the child's voice made Elizabeth's heart ache. "Sometimes people just want to help, Melody." Not in my experience," the girl replied, with such certainty that Elizabeth couldn't find a suitable response. Downstairs, the formal dining room had been set for breakfast. Fine china, silver cutlery, and crystal glasses arranged with military precision around the massive mahogany table. Charles sat at the head, reading financial reports while absently stirring his coffee. "Ah, there you are," he said, glancing up as Elizabeth entered. "I've been reviewing the quarterly projections for our tech division. Quite promising, especially the new AI applications." Elizabeth nodded distractedly. "Where's Noah?" "Mrs." Winters took him to the park. His ears seemed completely recovered, which is... Charles hesitated. Remarkable, to say the least. Elizabeth sat down across from her grandfather. "We need to talk about Melody." Charles set his papers aside, giving her his full attention, a rarity that wasn't lost on her. "Yes, we do. I've made some inquiries." Her mother, Sophia Coleman, was indeed a nurse at Massachusetts General. Excellent reputation by all accounts. She died 14 months ago from aggressive pancreatic cancer. "And Melody has been homeless since then?" Elizabeth asked, horrified. "Not immediately," Charles corrected. They had a small apartment, paid through the month of her mother's death. Melody apparently stayed there alone until the landlord discovered her and contacted child services. She ran away from her first foster placement and has been on the streets since. "She's only 8, grandfather." "I'm aware of her age, Elizabeth," Charles replied, a touch of impatience coloring his tone. "The question is, What do we do now? Emergency guardianship is temporary. We need a plan. Elizabeth met his gaze directly. I want to adopt her. Charles's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. You're 25, unmarried, and your life consists of charity galas and art history lectures. What do you know about raising a traumatized child? What did you know about raising me when my parents died? Elizabeth challenged. You were 67, widowed, and had spent your life in boardrooms, yet here I am. A complicated emotion flickered across Charles's face. Pride mingled with something softer, more vulnerable. Before he could respond, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Melody stood uncertainly on the threshold, wearing clothes that Mrs. Peterson had found, a simple blue dress that hung loosely on her thin frame and white socks that slouched around her ankles. Am I late? She asked anxiously. Not at all, Elizabeth assured her, rising to pull out a chair. Come sit. What would you like for breakfast? Melody climbed onto the chair, her eyes widening at the spread on the sideboard. Platters of pancakes, eggs prepared 3 ways, bacon, sausage, fresh fruit, and pastries. I can choose anything? She asked incredulously. Within reason, Charles interjected dryly. Though I'd advise against combining the chocolate croissants with the maple syrup, Mrs. Peterson's pancakes are quite sweet enough on their own. Melody stared at him for a moment, then unexpectedly giggled. You're funny when you're not being scary. Charles raised an eyebrow but said nothing, returning to his coffee as Elizabeth helped Melody fill a plate. The girl ate with careful restraint that belied her obvious hunger, taking small, deliberate bites and dabbing her mouth with a napkin after each one. Elizabeth recognized the behavior. Melody was trying to prove she had manners, that she belonged at this table. Mr. Evans, Melody said suddenly between bites of pancake, do you know how rich you are? Charles looked up, startled by the direct question. I have a general idea of my net worth, yes, but do you know exactly? Like to the dollar? Not to the dollar, no. My financial affairs are rather complex. Melody nodded thoughtfully. My mom always knew exactly how much money we had. Down to the penny. She kept a little notebook and wrote everything down. Something in Charles's expression softened. That's very responsible. She said, it's more important to know what you have when you don't have much. Melody speared a strawberry with her fork. Do you have any rules I should know for staying here? The abrupt change of subject caught both adults off guard. Elizabeth exchanged a glance with her grandfather. Rules? Charles repeated, as if the concept were novel. Yeah, like things I'm not supposed to touch, or places I can't go. Melody's tone was practical, devoid of self-pity. The lady at the shelter had lots of rules. Charles cleared his throat. Well, I suppose the usual expectations apply. Respect for property, appropriate behavior. What grandfather means, Elizabeth interrupted gently, is that we want you to feel at home here. You're not a guest who has to worry about breaking rules. Melody looked skeptical. Everyone has rules. Indeed, Charles agreed, something like approval flickering in his eyes. Perhaps the most important one is honesty. In this house, we value truth even when it's uncomfortable. That's easy, Melody shrugged. I'm always honest. Mom said lying takes too much work to remember. A soft chime sounded from the foyer, and moments later, Whitfield appeared at the dining room door. Mr. Alejandro Ruiz is here to see you, sir, he announced with perfect decorum. He says it concerns Miss Melody. Charles and Elizabeth exchanged surprised glances. The hospital janitor? Elizabeth asked. How did he know where to find us? The Evans residence isn't exactly a state secret, Elizabeth, Charles replied dryly, rising from his chair. Show him in, Whitfield. As the butler departed, Melody suddenly looked tense. Is he going to take me away? Elizabeth quickly moved to reassure her. No, of course not. No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go. Charles gave his granddaughter a warning look, clearly concerned about making promises they might not be able to keep. Before he could say anything, however, Alejandro appeared in the doorway, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the opulent surroundings. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, twisting his worn cap in his hands. "But there's something you need to know about Melody. Something important." Alejandro stood awkwardly in the Evans dining room, his weathered work boots a stark contrast to the Persian carpet beneath them. "Perhaps we should speak privately," he suggested with a meaningful glance toward Melody. Charles nodded, rising from his chair. "My study would be appropriate." "Elizabeth, would you—" "I want to hear too," Melody interrupted, her small voice surprisingly firm. "If it's about me, I should know." The adults exchanged glances, silently debating the wisdom of including an 8-year-old in what promised to be a serious conversation. Finally, Elizabeth nodded. "She's right. Besides, we promised honesty." Charles sighed, but acquiesced. "Very well. This way, Mr. Ruiz." The study was exactly what one might expect of a billionaire financier. Walnut paneling, leather-bound books lining the walls, and a massive desk that had reportedly once belonged to J.P. Morgan. Alejandro perched uncomfortably on the edge of an armchair while Charles took his position behind the desk. Elizabeth sat next to Melody on a leather sofa, the girl's legs dangling above the floor. "Now," Charles said, steepling his fingers, "what's this important information about Melody?" Alejandro took a deep breath. "First, I want you to know that I've been looking out for her as much as I could since her mother died. Sophia, that was her mother. She was a good person, a dedicated nurse." "We've verified that," Charles confirmed, "though I'm curious about your connection to them." "Sophia treated me with respect," Alejandro said simply. "Not all medical staff extend that courtesy to janitorial workers. When she fell ill, I tried to help, bringing meals, running errands. After she passed, I kept an eye on Melody when I could, but—" He spread his hands helplessly. "I work 3 jobs. I couldn't offer her a home." "We appreciate your concern," Elizabeth said gently. "But you mentioned there was something specific we needed to know." Alejandro nodded, his expression growing serious. 2 days before Sophia died, she asked to speak with me privately. She was very weak by then, but extremely agitated. She made me promise to watch over Melody, said there were people who might. He hesitated, glancing at the child, who might not have her best interests at heart. Charles leaned forward, suddenly more attentive. "What people, specifically?" "She wouldn't say exactly, but she gave me this." Alejandro reached into his jacket and withdrew a small flash drive. "She said if anything happened to her, anything suspicious, I should find a way to get this information to someone powerful enough to protect Melody." "Suspicious?" Elizabeth echoed. "I thought she died of cancer." "She did," Alejandro confirmed. "But she seemed afraid, not just of dying, but of something else." Melody, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Mum was scared at the end. She kept checking the door, even in the hospital." Charles took the flash drive, examining it with the scrutiny of a man who'd built his fortune on attention to detail. "Have you looked at what's on this?" Alejandro shook his head. "I don't even own a computer, but Sophia was insistent that it contained information that could put Melody in danger." He hesitated. "There's one more thing. The last time I saw Sophia alive, she whispered something strange. She said, 'It's about the clinical trials. They can't know she was there.'" A heavy silence fell over the room. Elizabeth unconsciously tightened her arm around Melody's shoulders. "Clinical trials," Charles repeated thoughtfully. "Was Sophia participating in experimental treatment for her cancer?" "Not that I know of," Alejandro replied. "By the time I met her, she was already in hospice care. The doctors had said there was nothing more they could do. Charles rose from his desk and walked to a wall panel, which slid back at his touch to reveal a hidden computer setup. Without a word, he inserted the flash drive. "Password protected," he muttered after a moment. "Mr. Ruiz, did Sophia give you any indication of what the password might be?" Alejandro shook his head helplessly. "I'm sorry, no." All eyes turned to Melody, who was staring at the computer screen with an intensity that seemed at odds with her young age. "Melody," Elizabeth asked gently, "do you know what password your mother might have used? Something important to her, perhaps?" The girl was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Try Melody Grace 0212, she finally suggested. "That's my birthday. Mom used it for everything." Charles typed in the suggestion, then shook his head. "Incorrect." "What about Sofmel 2015? Alejandro offered. "That was the year I first met them." "Another attempt, another failure." "Wait," Melody said suddenly. "Try Blackbird 47. Dean Charles raised an eyebrow but complied. The screen immediately changed, files populating the display. "How did you know that?" Elizabeth asked, surprised. "Mom used to sing Blackbird to me every night," Melody explained. "And 47 was her favorite number. She said it was the most beautiful prime number." Charles was already scanning through the files, his expression growing increasingly grave. These appeared to be medical records, research notes, and financial transfers. He looked up sharply. "Elizabeth, take Melody upstairs, please." "No," Melody protested immediately. "I want to know. It's about my mom." Charles hesitated, clearly torn between protecting a child from potentially disturbing information and respecting her right to know about her own mother. "Perhaps a compromise," Elizabeth suggested diplomatically. "Grandfather, you and Mr. Ruiz can review the files first, then share what's appropriate." Melody didn't appear satisfied with this solution, but before she could object further, the study door burst open. Noah ran in, his face alight with excitement, followed by his harried-looking nanny. "Melody, come see! Found a frog in the garden!" The little boy grabbed Melody's hand, pulling insistently. For the first time since her arrival, Melody looked truly childlike, momentarily distracted from adult concerns by the simple joy of a newfound amphibian. She allowed herself to be tugged toward the door, though she cast a lingering look at the computer screen. "This isn't over," she informed Charles, with such adult seriousness that, despite the gravity of the situation, he nearly smiled. As the children disappeared down the hallway with Mrs. Winters in pursuit, Elizabeth turned back to the men. "What's on that drive, Grandfather?" Charles's expression had returned to its usual inscrutable mask. "Something very troubling indeed." He turned to Alejandro. "Mr. Ruiz, I think you should see this too, since Sophia trusted you. But first—" He pressed a button on his desk, and Whitfield appeared so promptly one might have suspected he'd been hovering nearby. "Yes, Mr. Evans? Call Preston. Tell him I need the security team doubled immediately. And contact Ramirez. I want background checks on everyone who's entered this house in the past week." Charles's voice had taken on a steely quality that Elizabeth recognized from his rare appearances in the Evans Group boardroom. "And Whitfield? Until further notice, the children do not leave the premises without armed escort." The butler's eyebrows rose slightly, but he merely nodded. "Very good, sir." As Whitfield departed, Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "Grandfather, what exactly are we dealing with here?" Charles turned the computer screen so she could see it. "If these documents are authentic, and I suspect they are, Sophia Coleman didn't just witness something illegal in those clinical trials." He pointed to a highlighted section of text. "She was gathering evidence against one of the most powerful pharmaceutical companies in the world." 3 days had passed since Alejandro's revelatory visit, and the Evans mansion had transformed into something resembling a fortress. Security personnel patrolled the grounds, Windows had been fitted with bulletproof glass, and no one entered or left without clearance. For Melody, however, the most significant change had been internal. Watching the adults scramble to implement security measures had confirmed her long-held suspicion. The world was not safe, especially for little girls without money or power. She sat now in the mansion's library, perched on a window seat overlooking the garden, where Noah played under the watchful eye of both his nanny and 2 security guards. Elizabeth entered carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate, the cinnamon scent wafting ahead of her. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, settling beside Melody. "I don't think they're worth that much," the girl replied, accepting the mug carefully. Elizabeth smiled, though her eyes remained concerned. "You've been very quiet today." Melody shrugged, her gaze fixed on the scene outside. "I'm used to being quiet. People don't notice you as much that way." The simple statement hung between them, loaded with implications about Melody's survival strategies over the past year. "Has anyone told you what was on my mom's flash drive?" Melody asked suddenly. Elizabeth hesitated, weighing honesty against protection. "Some of it, yes. Your grandfather thought it best to keep me in the dark." Melody's voice carried an acid edge unusual for a child. "Like I haven't already seen worse things than whatever's on that drive?" Elizabeth studied the girl beside her, so small, yet carrying burdens that would crush many adults. "You're right," she said finally. "You deserve to know." Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth began to explain. "Your mother was working at a hospital where a company called Neurotech was conducting clinical trials for a new medication. A neural regenerator that could potentially repair damage to the auditory nerves." Melody's eyes widened slightly. "Like what helped Noah's ears?" "Not exactly," Elizabeth clarified. "Noah had an infection, not nerve damage. But yes, it was related to hearing loss." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "According to your mother's notes, Neurotech was falsifying data. The drug wasn't working as claimed, and worse, it was causing serious side effects that they were covering up." "What kind of side effects?" Melody asked, her voice suddenly small. "Neurological damage. Some patients experienced tremors, memory loss, even seizures." Elizabeth watched the girl's face closely, prepared to stop if it became too much, but Melody remained composed. "Your mother was gathering evidence to expose them. She had documented everything. The real trial results, internal emails discussing the cover-up, even financial records showing bribes to regulators." Melody absorbed this information with a gravity beyond her years. Is that why she was scared at the end? She thought they knew what she was doing. "We think so," Elizabeth confirmed. "Your grandfather has taken the evidence to some trustworthy contacts in the FBI. He's also had his security team investigating whether anyone from Neurotech might have been watching your mother, or you." Melody nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "The man in the park," she murmured. "What man?" Elizabeth asked sharply. "There was a man who used to watch me sometimes, after Mom died. I noticed him 3 or 4 times near the library where I'd go during the day. He never did anything, just watched." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. "Did you tell anyone about this?" "Who would I tell?" Melody asked with heartbreaking practicality. "The librarian thought I was waiting for my parents. The shelter staff were always too busy, and the police." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. A homeless child's concerns would hardly be a priority. Elizabeth made a mental note to have Charles's security team investigate this immediately. "Is there anything else you remember? Anything unusual that happened after your mother died?" Melody was quiet for a long moment, sipping her hot chocolate. "Someone broke into our apartment," she finally said. "After Mom died, but before the landlord found me. I was hiding in the closet when they came in. They took Mom's laptop and some files from her work bag." "You never mentioned this before." Elizabeth said gently. "You never asked." Melody's response wasn't accusatory, merely factual. "Besides, I thought it was just regular burglars. We didn't have anything valuable." Elizabeth fought to keep her expression neutral, not wanting to frighten the girl further. "Did you see what they looked like?" Melody shook her head. "I stayed hidden, but I heard them talking. 2 men, I think. One had a weird accent." Before Elizabeth could ask more, the library door opened. Charles entered, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. His tie was loosened, and he carried his suit jacket over his arm. Small details that, to those who knew him well, signaled extreme distress. "Grandfather? What's wrong?" Charles glanced at Melody, clearly debating whether to speak freely in her presence. The girl met his gaze unflinchingly. "You might as well tell both of us," she said. "I'm going to find out anyway." A fleeting smile touched Charles's lips. "You're quite right." He set his jacket on a nearby chair and ran a hand through his silver hair. "I've just had a rather illuminating conversation with Senator Reeves, who serves on the Pharmaceutical Oversight Committee. It seems Neurotech is not just any company, it's a subsidiary of Global Life Pharmaceuticals." Elizabeth inhaled sharply. "The largest pharmaceutical conglomerate in the world." "Indeed, with annual revenues exceeding the GDP of many countries and an army of lawyers and lobbyists at their disposal." Charles's voice was grim. "They've already attempted to contact me through 3 different channels, ostensibly to discuss a matter of mutual concern." "They know we have the files," Elizabeth concluded. "So it would seem." Charles turned to Melody, his expression softening slightly. "Which brings me to a difficult decision. I believe it would be prudent for you and Noah to relocate temporarily to our house in Switzerland. Elizabeth will accompany you, of course." "You want to send us away," Melody said flatly. "I want to ensure your safety," Charles corrected. "The Swiss property is isolated, secure, and outside U.S. jurisdiction. It would be significantly more difficult for Global Life to exert influence there." Elizabeth started to object, but the sound of shattering glass interrupted her. All 3 turned toward the window in time to see Noah fall to the ground, his nanny screaming as one of the security guards tackled her to the grass. "Noah!" Elizabeth cried, already racing toward the door. Charles moved with surprising agility for his age, grabbing the security phone from his desk. "Lock down the property. Medical team to the South Garden immediately." Melody remained frozen by the window, watching as chaos erupted below. The security guards had formed a protective circle around Noah's small body, weapons drawn as they scanned the surrounding trees. "Is he?" she whispered, unable to complete the question. Charles was already halfway to the door, phone still pressed to his ear. "Stay here," he commanded. "Do not move from this room until I return." As the door closed behind him, Melody sank back onto the window seat, her young face a mask of shock and guilt. "This is because of me," she whispered to the empty room. "They're after me, and Noah got hurt instead." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance as the first emergency vehicles approached the gates of the Evans estate. Melody watched, tears streaming silently down her face, as a small figure was lifted onto a stretcher. Noah's favorite dinosaur t-shirt now stained an ominous red. The private hospital wing was eerily quiet, the only sounds the steady beeping of monitors and the soft rustle of nurses moving efficiently between rooms. Charles stood at the window of the waiting area, his tall frame silhouetted against the city lights beyond. Elizabeth sat nearby, her face pale, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The bullet only grazed him, the doctor had assured them hours earlier. 2 inches to the left, and we'd be having a very different conversation. But children are remarkably resilient. Physically, he'll make a complete recovery. Physically. The unspoken implication hung in the air. The psychological impact of being shot at age 2 remained to be seen. "I've arranged for the jet to be ready at dawn," Charles said, breaking the silence without turning from the window. "The Swiss property has been secured. Medical staff will accompany you to monitor Noah's condition during the flight." Elizabeth nodded mechanically, too exhausted to argue. "What about you?" "I'll remain here. These people attacked my family." Charles's voice carried a cold fury that Elizabeth had never heard before. "They will regret that decision." "Mr. Evans?" A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Your grandson is asking for you." Charles nodded, his expression softening slightly as he followed the nurse. Elizabeth remained seated, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. The FBI had already taken statements. Ballistics experts had collected evidence from the garden, and Charles's private security team had established a perimeter around the hospital floor. Yet none of it seemed sufficient protection against an enemy powerful enough to strike at the Evans family in their own home. A small sound from the hallway caught her attention. Not footsteps, but something softer, like fabric brushing against a wall. Elizabeth rose quietly and moved to the door, peering out into the dimly lit corridor. Melody stood outside Noah's room, pressed against the wall as if trying to make herself invisible. She wore the pajamas Mrs. Peterson had laid out for her, pale yellow flannel with white clouds, but her feet were bare on the cold hospital floor. "Melody," Elizabeth called softly. "What are you doing here? How did you get past security?" The girl flinched slightly at being discovered but didn't move from her position. "They weren't looking for someone my size," she said simply. "I hid in the laundry cart when they changed shifts." Despite everything, Elizabeth felt a flicker of reluctant admiration for the child's resourcefulness. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Nowhere is safe," Melody replied with that disconcerting adult perspective. "I needed to see him, to say sorry." Elizabeth approached slowly, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes. "Melody, this isn't your fault." "Yes, it is." The certainty in her voice was heartbreaking. "They were shooting at me. Noah got hurt because I'm here." "No." Elizabeth's tone left no room for argument. "Noah was hurt because bad people made evil choices. You are a child. None of this is your responsibility." Melody looked unconvinced but didn't argue further. "Can I see him? Please. I just want to make sure he's okay." Elizabeth hesitated. Noah was sedated, his small body connected to monitors and IV lines, a potentially frightening sight for another child. But the determination in Melody's eyes suggested she wouldn't be easily dissuaded. "All right," Elizabeth conceded, "but just for a minute, and then we need to get you back to the safe house." She took Melody's hand, noting how cold the child's fingers felt, and led her quietly into Noah's room. Charles sat beside the bed, one gnarled hand resting gently on his grandson's arm. He looked up sharply as they entered, his expression cycling rapidly from alarm to recognition to resignation. "I should have known you'd find a way here," he said to Melody, his tone hovering between irritation and grudging respect. Melody ignored him, her attention fixed entirely on Noah. The toddler lay unnaturally still, his usually animated face peaceful in medicated sleep, a thick white bandage wrapped around his left shoulder. "Will it hurt when he wakes up?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Charles answered honestly, "but they'll give him medicine for the pain." Melody nodded, accepting this truth without childish platitudes. "I made him a present." She reached into the pocket of her pajamas and withdrew a small, crudely folded paper crane. "Mrs. Peterson showed me how. She said in Japan, they believe paper cranes bring healing." With careful movements, she placed the origami bird on Noah's bedside table. Then, to the adult's surprise, she leaned forward and whispered something in the sleeping boy's ear. "What did you tell him?" Elizabeth asked when Melody straightened. "A secret," the girl replied simply. Between friends. Charles cleared his throat, drawing their attention. As touching as this reunion is, we have a security breach to address. How exactly did you evade my security team, young lady? Melody shrugged, seemingly unintimidated by his stern tone. People don't look for kids in places kids aren't supposed to be. And grown-ups never look down. A sound suspiciously like a chuckle escaped Charles before he could suppress it. Yes, well, that oversight will be corrected. Elizabeth, please take Melody back to... The door opened, cutting off his instructions. A security guard entered, his expression apologetic but urgent. Sir, there's a situation downstairs. A man claiming to be Melody's uncle is demanding to see her. He has documentation, birth certificate, family photos, even a court order granting him temporary custody. Elizabeth instinctively moved closer to Melody, who had gone perfectly still. I don't have an uncle, the girl whispered, her face suddenly ashen. Mom always said it was just us. Charles rose from his chair, straightening to his full, impressive height. Detain him. I want to see these supposed documents myself. The guard hesitated. Sir, he's not alone. He has 2 lawyers with him, and they're threatening to involve the police if we don't produce the child immediately. A tense silence fell over the room. Even at 8, Melody understood the implications. Legal claims could potentially override the Evans family's emergency guardianship. I'm not going with them, she stated firmly. They're lying. They're the ones who want my mum's files. Charles's expression hardened into the mask that had intimidated Wall Street titans for decades. No one is taking this child anywhere. Elizabeth, take Melody through the service elevator to the parking garage. Preston is waiting with the car. Go directly to the airfield. The jet is already fueled and cleared for takeoff. But Noah, Elizabeth began, will follow with the medical team once he's stabilized for travel, Charles finished. Now go. I'll handle our unexpected visitors. Elizabeth didn't waste time arguing. She swept Melody into her arms and moved swiftly toward the door, pausing only when the girl called out, Mr. Evans! Melody's voice was small but clear. Be careful. These are bad people. Charles's stern expression softened momentarily. I've dealt with bad people my entire career, my dear. It's practically a hobby of mine. As Elizabeth carried Melody toward the service elevator, the girl clung tightly to her neck. I hate running away, she whispered fiercely. Mom and I were always running. We're not running away, Elizabeth corrected, punching the elevator button with perhaps more force than necessary. We're making a strategic retreat. There's a difference. What's the difference? Melody asked skeptically. Elizabeth's smile held a hint of her grandfather's steel. When you run away, you're just trying to escape. When you make a strategic retreat, you're gathering your resources to come back and fight. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the hospital's basement level. As they stepped inside, Melody cast one last glance toward the hallway where Noah lay sleeping. Will he be okay without us? She asked, a tremor in her voice betraying the child beneath her prematurely mature exterior. Elizabeth tightened her hold on the girl. Noah has the best medical care in the world, and a grandfather who would move heaven and earth to protect him. She pressed the button for the parking garage. And right now, the best thing we can do for Noah is keep you safe. That's what he'd want too. As the elevator descended, Melody rested her head against Elizabeth's shoulder, a rare gesture of childlike vulnerability. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she whispered. I just wanted his ears to stop hurting. I know, Elizabeth murmured, stroking the girl's dark hair. And you did help him. Now it's our turn to help you. The elevator doors opened onto the dimly lit parking garage, where Preston, Charles's head of security, waited beside a black armored SUV. His normally impassive face showed visible relief as they approached. Ms. Elizabeth, we need to move quickly. There's been a complication. What kind of complication? Elizabeth asked, already moving toward the vehicle. Preston opened the rear door, his voice dropping to ensure only Elizabeth could hear. The man claiming to be Melody's uncle, he's a senior executive at Global Life Pharmaceuticals. The Evans family jet streaked eastward over the Atlantic, its sleek form barely visible against the night sky. Inside the luxurious cabin, Elizabeth sat beside Melody, watching the girl sleep fitfully, small hands occasionally twitching as if reaching for something in her dreams. 6 hours had passed since their hasty departure from Boston. Noah had been stabilized and transported separately, accompanied by his medical team, while Charles remained behind to handle the legal maneuvering that would inevitably follow. "Ms. Elizabeth?" The flight attendant approached quietly. "Mr. Evans is on the secure line for you." Elizabeth carefully extricated herself from Melody's grasp and moved to the private communications suite at the rear of the aircraft. Her grandfather's face appeared on the screen, looking unusually weary. "How is she?" he asked without preamble. "Finally sleeping," Elizabeth replied. "She's been asking about Noah. His condition is stable. The medical team reports his vitals are strong. They expect to depart within 3 hours." Charles rubbed his temples, a rare display of fatigue. "We've had an interesting development here." Elizabeth tensed. "The man claiming to be Melody's uncle?" "Girl, Richard Hargrove, Executive Vice President of Research and Development at Global Life," Charles confirmed. "A very convincing performance, complete with doctored birth certificates and manipulated photographs. Unfortunately for him, Judge Harrison is an old friend who doesn't appreciate being presented with fraudulent documents." "So they've backed off?" Charles's expression darkened. "Temporarily, but they're escalating in other ways. 2 hours ago, our legal department received notice of a lawsuit claiming defamation, corporate espionage, and theft of proprietary information. They're demanding all copies of Sophia Coleman's files be returned immediately." "That's absurd," Elizabeth protested. "Those files document their criminal behavior." "Indeed, which is why I've already arranged for copies to be delivered to several trusted journalists, with instructions to publish everything if anything happens to any member of our family, including Melody." Elizabeth smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Her grandfather had always been 10 steps ahead of his opponents. "What about the FBI investigation?" Charles sighed. "Proceeding but slowly. Global Life has significant political influence. However, Senator Reeves assures me the evidence is too compelling to be buried entirely." A soft sound behind Elizabeth made her turn. Melody stood in the doorway, her small face solemn in the dim cabin light. "You should be sleeping," Elizabeth said gently. "I heard you talking about me." Melody approached the screen, studying Charles with an intensity that made her seem far older than her 8 years. "They're still trying to get me, aren't they?" Charles considered the child for a moment before answering. "Yes, but not for the reason you might think. According to our investigation, you were present during some of the early clinical trials. Your mother would bring you to work occasionally when childcare arrangements fell through." Melody nodded slowly. "Sometimes I'd sit in the observation room and draw pictures while Mum worked. We believe you may have witnessed something significant, perhaps without even realizing it." Charles's voice was gentle but direct, treating Melody like a capable participant rather than a child to be protected from truth. "Do you remember anything unusual about those visits? Anything that seemed strange or wrong?" Melody's brow furrowed in concentration. "There was one time. A patient started shaking really bad during a test. The doctors were yelling and Mom ran to help. I wasn't supposed to leave the observation room, but I was scared, so I followed her." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with her grandfather. "What happened then, Melody?" The patient stopped shaking and got really still. One of the doctors, a tall man with glasses, he said something like, "This one doesn't go in the report either. Mom looked really upset, but she didn't say anything until later. Later? Charles prompted. In the car. She was talking on the phone with someone. She thought I was listening to my music, but the battery was dead. She said, "That's the third one they've covered up. I can't be part of this anymore." A heavy silence followed this revelation. Elizabeth fought to keep her expression neutral, not wanting to frighten Melody further. Charles, however, looked grimly satisfied, as if a suspicion had been confirmed. "Melody," he said carefully, "if we showed you photographs, do you think you might recognize this doctor with glasses?" The girl nodded. "I think so." He had a weird laugh, like a hiccup at the end. She demonstrated, the childish imitation somehow making the situation even more disturbing. "We'll arrange that when you arrive in Switzerland," Charles assured her. "For now, try to get some rest. You're safe on the plane." As if on cue, the aircraft encountered turbulence, causing Melody to stumble slightly. Elizabeth steadied her with a gentle hand. "Safe is relative," the girl muttered with her typical dry perspective. After saying goodbye to Charles, Elizabeth led Melody back to their seats. The cabin was dimly lit, most of the lights turned down to encourage sleep during the overnight flight. "What's going to happen when we get to Switzerland?" Melody asked as Elizabeth helped her buckle her seatbelt. "We'll go to my grandfather's house in the mountains. It's very secluded and has excellent security. Noah will join us there once he's cleared for travel." Melody nodded thoughtfully. "And then what? We just hide forever?" Elizabeth sighed, recognizing the impossibility of platitudes with this preternaturally perceptive child. "No, not forever. My grandfather is very good at fighting battles like this. He'll find a way to make it safe for you." "Because he's rich?" The question held no judgment, merely curiosity. "Partly," Elizabeth admitted. "Money gives him resources and influence, but mostly because he's stubborn and hates injustice, two qualities you seem to share with him." This earned a small smile from Melody. "He's not as scary as he looks." "Don't tell him that," Elizabeth stage whispered. "He's spent decades perfecting that intimidating scowl." Melody giggled, a rare, purely childlike sound that made Elizabeth's heart lift. For a moment, the weight of their situation seemed to lift slightly. The moment was shattered by a sudden lurch of the aircraft, followed by the pilot's voice over the intercom. "Miss Evans, we're experiencing some instrument irregularities. Nothing to be concerned about, but I recommend you and your guest secure yourselves for potential turbulence." Elizabeth frowned. The Evans jet was meticulously maintained, with systems checked before every flight. Instrument failures were virtually unheard of. "Something's wrong," Melody whispered, her intuition once again unnervingly accurate. Before Elizabeth could respond, the cabin lights flickered, then went out entirely. Emergency lighting activated seconds later, bathing the interior in an eerie blue glow. The pilot's voice came again, this time with a noticeable edge of tension. "Ms. Evans, please come to the cockpit immediately." Elizabeth hesitated, unwilling to leave Melody alone. "Go," the girl urged. "I'll stay buckled in, I promise." With a reassuring squeeze of Melody's hand, Elizabeth made her way forward. The cockpit door opened before she could knock. The pilot, Captain Reynolds, a former Air Force officer who had flown for the Evans family for 15 years, gestured her inside. His face was grave. "What's happening, James?" Elizabeth asked, fighting to keep her voice calm. "We're being followed," he replied, pointing to a radar display. "Two aircraft, maintaining exact distance and matching our every course correction. They appeared about 20 minutes ago, approaching from the north." "Military?" Elizabeth asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Unlikely. Their flight patterns suggest private jets, and they're not responding to any communications." Captain Reynolds's expression was grim. "In my experience, that's not friendly behavior." Elizabeth felt a chill run through her. What are our options? Limited. We're over open water, hours from the nearest airfield. I've already altered course toward the Azores, but if these aircraft have hostile intent... He left the sentence unfinished. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, channeling her grandfather's decisive energy. Contact Charles immediately. Use the secure channel. And increase speed. Get us to the Azores as quickly as possible. As she turned to return to the cabin, Captain Reynolds stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. Miss Evans. These people, whoever they are, they were waiting for us. They knew our flight path. The implication was clear. Someone had betrayed them, someone with access to the Evans family's closely guarded information. Elizabeth nodded grimly. I understand. Trust no one until we hear from my grandfather. She returned to find Melody exactly where she'd left her, still buckled into her seat. But the girl's expression had changed. The fear had been replaced by a steely determination that seemed to transform her young face. They found us, didn't they? Melody asked quietly. Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to lie. Yes, but we're changing course. We'll be okay. Melody nodded, as if this confirmation merely validated what she already knew. My mum always said if you run from bad people, you have to be smarter than them, not just faster. Despite everything, Elizabeth felt a smile tug at her lips. Your mother was a very wise woman. The wisest, Melody agreed softly. Then with a directness that took Elizabeth aback, if something happens to me, promise you'll make sure Noah is okay. Nothing is going to happen to either of you, Elizabeth insisted, taking the girl's small hands in her own. I promise. As if in direct challenge to her words, the aircraft suddenly shuddered violently. Warning lights flashed across the cabin, and the intercom crackled to life once more. Miss Evans, secure yourselves immediately. We've lost pressure in one of the hydraulic systems. We're diverting to Santa Maria Airport for emergency landing. Melody's eyes were wide but dry, a child who had learned early that tears rarely changed outcomes. I think we need to be smarter right now, she whispered. Elizabeth could only hold her close as the plane banked sharply to the left, beginning its descent toward the tiny Atlantic island and whatever awaited them there. The emergency landing on Santa Maria Island wasn't so much a landing as a controlled crash. Captain Reynolds managed to bring the crippled aircraft down on the small runway, the scream of metal drowning out Melody's prayers as the jet skidded to a halt mere feet from the end of the tarmac. Are you hurt? Elizabeth asked, her own voice shaking as she checked Melody for injuries. I'm okay, the girl replied, remarkably composed. We need to move fast. Elizabeth couldn't argue with that assessment. Through the window, she could see airport vehicles rushing toward them, but there was no telling who else might be waiting. Captain Reynolds appeared from the cockpit, a small backpack in hand. Miss Evans, we need to get off this aircraft immediately. The pursuing jets have requested landing clearance. Can the tower deny them? Elizabeth asked, helping Melody unbuckle. Reynolds shook his head grimly. They've identified themselves as medical transport. It would raise too many questions to turn them away. Of course they did, Elizabeth muttered. Always a step ahead. Melody tugged at Elizabeth's sleeve. We need to hide, not run. Mom said when bad people are looking for you, sometimes the best place is right under their noses. Elizabeth considered this wisdom for a moment, then turned to Reynolds. Is the emergency kit still aboard? Minutes later, as airport personnel swarmed the Evans jet, 3 figures slipped away from the rear exit, not running toward the terminal, but moving deliberately toward the maintenance hangars at the far end of the field. Elizabeth's blonde hair was now hidden under a dark cap, her expensive clothing replaced by the practical jumpsuit from the emergency kit. Melody wore a similar outfit, rolled up at the sleeves and pant legs, while Reynolds had changed into civilian clothes. The flight crew will tell them we left on the first emergency vehicle, Reynolds explained as they walked. It should buy us some time. Time for what? Melody asked practically. "We're stuck on an island." "Time for this," Elizabeth replied, pulling out a satellite phone, "and for my grandfather to work his magic." The maintenance hangar smelled of oil and metal, the dim interior a welcome respite from the bright morning sun. Reynolds had found them this temporary sanctuary through a brief conversation with a maintenance worker, a conversation aided by a generous handful of euros from Elizabeth's emergency funds. "Grandfather is sending a yacht," Elizabeth announced, ending her call on the satellite phone. "ETA 6 hours. "That's a long time," Melody observed, sitting cross-legged on a tarp-covered crate. "Those men will search the whole airport by then." Reynolds nodded grimly. "The girl's right. We need a better hiding place." Elizabeth paced the concrete floor, mind racing. "What about the town? We could blend in with tourists." "Not with a child," Reynolds countered. "They'll be looking specifically for a woman with a young girl." Melody had grown quiet, her gaze fixed on something outside the partially open hangar door. "Someone's coming," she whispered. Reynolds immediately moved to the door, peering carefully through the crack. "Maintenance worker, the same one who let us in." The man entered, his weathered face tense. "You must go," he said in heavily accented English. "Men asking questions at terminal, showing pictures." Elizabeth felt her heart sink. "How many?" "4 men. Very." He made a gesture with his hands, indicating size and menace. "Important looking, not police." Reynolds exchanged a look with Elizabeth. "Corporate security, professionals. They offer money for information," the maintenance worker continued. "Very much money." The implication hung in the air. Their hiding place might soon be compromised if someone else at the airport decided the reward was worth the betrayal. "We need a boat," Elizabeth decided. "Something to get us away from the airport until the yacht arrives." The maintenance worker hesitated, then nodded slowly. "My brother has fishing boat. Small, not fast, but can take you along coast." Elizabeth reached for her purse, but the man held up his hand. "No money." "My mother was nurse too," he said, glancing at Melody with unexpected gentleness. "I hear you're talking. Something's more important than money." 30 minutes later, they were aboard a weathered fishing vessel that smelled strongly of its daily catch. The maintenance worker's brother, Antonio, guided them out of the small harbour, his curious glances suggesting he had questions, but the good sense not to ask them. As the small island grew more distant, Melody stood at the rail, salt spray dampening her face. "They won't stop looking, will they?" she asked quietly. Elizabeth joined her, placing a protective arm around the child's thin shoulders. "No, but neither will my grandfather." Melody nodded, accepting this reality with her usual stoicism. "In movies, the bad guys always lose in the end." "This isn't a movie, kiddo," Reynolds said, joining them at the rail. "But in my experience, people like your grandfather don't lose often, Ms. Evans." The yacht, when it finally appeared on the horizon, was not what Elizabeth had expected. Instead of her grandfather's usual 150-foot luxury vessel, a smaller, sleeker craft approached, clearly built for speed rather than comfort. "Smart," Reynolds commented, watching through binoculars. "Less conspicuous than the usual Evans flotilla." Antonio guided his fishing boat alongside the yacht with the skill of a man who had spent his life on water. A crew member tossed down a rope ladder, and Reynolds went first, followed by Melody, who climbed with surprising agility. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, pressing an envelope into Antonio's weathered hand before ascending. "For everything." The yacht's captain was a woman in her 40s with close-cropped grey hair and the alert eyes of someone who missed nothing. "Katerina Vasilyev," she introduced herself briskly. "Mr. Evans sent me personally. We depart immediately." Below deck, Elizabeth was surprised to find not luxury accommodations, but equipment more suited to a military operation: communications arrays, weapons lockers, and monitoring systems. "This isn't a pleasure craft," she observed. "It's mine," Katerina replied simply. "I work for your grandfather in specialized security situations." Melody explored the cabin with curious eyes. "Like when billionaires get shot at?" Katerina's severe expression softened slightly. "Precisely, little one. Now we have secure communications established with Mr. Evans. He wishes to speak with you both." Charles's face appeared on the monitor, looking more haggard than Elizabeth had ever seen him. "Thank God you're safe," he said without preamble. "The situation has escalated." "How's Noah?" Elizabeth asked immediately. "Stable and secure. I've moved him to an undisclosed medical facility." Charles paused, his expression grim. "The men who pursued your aircraft were indeed Globalife Security. They filed kidnapping charges against us, claiming Melody is the biological daughter of Richard Hargrove." "That's a lie!" Melody exclaimed, moving into view of the camera. "Of course it is," Charles agreed, "but they fabricated DNA evidence to support their claim. Fortunately, Judge Harrison has granted us an emergency injunction preventing any custody transfer while the evidence is examined." Elizabeth felt a chill run through her. "They're getting desperate." "Indeed, which suggests we're close to something they very much want to keep hidden." Charles leaned closer to the camera. "Melody, I need you to think very carefully. Those clinical trials you witnessed, was there anything unusual about the patients? Anything that might explain why Globalife is going to such lengths?" Melody's brow furrowed in concentration. "They were all kids," she said slowly. "Kids with hearing problems like Noah." Charles and Elizabeth exchanged a startled glance. "Children?" Charles repeated. "The trial documentation Sophia collected only mentioned adult subjects." "No, they were kids," Melody insisted. "Some were really little, like Noah. I remember because one of them had the same dinosaur toy." Elizabeth felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. They were conducting unauthorized trials on children. That's what your mother discovered. Illegal, unethical, and potentially catastrophic for Globalife if exposed, Charles added grimly. The company's value would collapse overnight. Katerina, who had been monitoring the vessel's systems, suddenly straightened. "We have company, fast-moving craft approaching from the northwest." The pursuing vessel appeared as a white speck on the horizon, growing larger with alarming speed. "How did they find us so quickly?" Elizabeth demanded, following Katerina to the bridge. The captain's expression was grim. "Professional trackers. They likely monitored all maritime communications after losing you at the airport." Reynolds joined them, his military training evident in his calm efficiency. "Options? We outrun them," Katerina replied, pushing the yacht's engines to maximum. "This craft is designed for speed, but we need to reach international waters." Elizabeth glanced back at Melody, who stood silently watching the approaching vessel, her small face set in lines too serious for a child. "You should go below," Elizabeth suggested gently. Melody shook her head. "I'm tired of hiding." And there was something in the girl's tone, a quiet determination, that reminded Elizabeth startlingly of her grandfather. She recognized then what Charles had perhaps seen from the beginning, a kindred spirit, a fighter unwilling to concede defeat even when overwhelmed. The pursuing vessel was close enough now to identify, a high-speed patrol craft, the kind used by private security firms. Through binoculars, Elizabeth could make out at least 4 men on deck, their stances suggesting military training. "They're gaining," Reynolds observed tensely. Katerina's hands remained steady on the controls. "We have one advantage they don't know about. Hold tight." She flipped a series of switches on the console, and the yacht suddenly surged forward with astonishing speed, the sudden acceleration forcing everyone to grab for support. "Hydrofoils," Katerina explained with grim satisfaction as the yacht's hull rose partially above the water. "Mr. Evans spares no expense for contingencies," The pursuing craft fell behind momentarily, but soon adjusted its course, pushing its own engines to match their speed. "They're still coming," Melody observed, her voice remarkably calm. Elizabeth pulled the girl close, both for Melody's comfort and her own. "We'll make it to international waters. Then they can't touch us legally." "Laws don't seem to matter much to these people," Reynolds remarked dryly. He was proven right moments later when a sharp crack echoed across the water, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. A bullet pinged off the yacht's stern, sending everyone ducking for cover. "Get below!" Katerina ordered, her voice allowing no argument. "Now!" Elizabeth pulled Melody toward the cabin hatch, but the girl suddenly twisted away. "Wait! I forgot my backpack!" "Melody, no!" Elizabeth lunged for her, but the girl had already darted back toward the rear deck, where she'd left the small pack containing her few possessions. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Elizabeth raced after Melody, heart pounding with terror. She reached the girl, just as Melody grabbed her backpack, wrapping her arms around the child and pulling her down behind a storage locker. "Are you crazy?" Elizabeth gasped, checking Melody frantically for injuries. The girl's eyes were wide but determined. "Mum's journal is in here," she explained, clutching the worn backpack, her real one, not the fake ones on the flash drive. "What are you talking about?" Before Melody could explain, the yacht lurched violently as Katerina executed a sharp turn, sending them both sliding across the deck. Elizabeth managed to catch the railing, holding Melody tightly against her. Through the spray, she could see their pursuers were now close enough to attempt boarding. One man stood ready at the bow with a grappling hook. "We're not going to outrun them," Elizabeth realized with sinking certainty. Melody looked up at her, eyes suddenly clear, and decided, "Then we have to outsmart them." "Mom always had two sets of everything important," Melody explained breathlessly as they huddled behind the yacht's cabin. "The real version and the decoy. She said that way, if bad people came looking, they'd take the fake and leave us alone." Elizabeth stared at the girl in dawning comprehension. "The flash drive Alejandro gave us probably has some real stuff on it," Melody confirmed, "but not everything. Mom's real journal has all the names, dates, everything about the kids in the trial." Another bullet pinged off the metal nearby, sending them both pressing closer to the deck. "Where is it?" Elizabeth asked urgently. Melody patted her backpack. "Sewn into the lining. Mum showed me how to hide things in seams." A sudden explosion of activity at the stern told them the pursuing vessel had managed to come alongside. Reynolds appeared, crouching low as he moved toward them. "They're boarding," he reported tersely. "Katerina's trying to radio for help, but we're being jammed." Elizabeth made a split-second decision. "Take Melody below. There's a hidden compartment in the forward cabin, Grandfather's panic room. Get her inside and don't open it for anyone but me or Katerina." "What about you?" Reynolds demanded. "I'm going to buy us some time." Elizabeth reached for Melody, giving the girl a fierce hug. "Go with Captain Reynolds. No arguments." For once, Melody didn't protest, perhaps recognizing the gravity of the moment. "Be careful," she whispered, pressing her backpack into Elizabeth's hands. "Take this. They'll be looking for it." A delight as Reynolds led Melody away, Elizabeth moved in the opposite direction, clutching the worn backpack like a shield. She had no real plan beyond creating a diversion, leading the pursuers away from Melody long enough for help to arrive. She heard the thud of boots on the deck behind her. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth broke cover and ran toward the bow, making herself as visible as possible. "There!" a man's voice shouted. "She has the package!" Elizabeth's heart pounded as she raced across the open deck, bullets pinging around her. She rounded the cabin and nearly collided with Katerina, who had abandoned the bridge with a pistol in hand. "3 men boarding," the captain reported calmly, as if discussing the weather. "1 still on their vessel." "They think I have what they want," Elizabeth gasped, holding up the backpack. Melody says her mother's real journal is hidden inside. Katerina nodded, quickly grasping the situation. The forward compartment? Reynolds is taking her there now. Good. Katerina handed Elizabeth a small radio. Your grandfather's people should be within range in approximately 15 minutes. Think we can hold them off that long? The grim determination in the captain's eyes answered the question before Elizabeth could. These men might have training and weapons, but they were facing women with something far more powerful to fight for. Just keep them away from Melody, Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite her fear. Katerina's smile was cold as steel. With pleasure. Gilles? The standoff lasted 12 minutes. Elizabeth had barricaded herself in the main cabin, Melody's backpack clutched tightly in her hands. Through the reinforced windows, she could see two of the intruders methodically searching the yacht, while a third kept watch on their own vessel. Katerina had disappeared, a tactical decision that forced their pursuers to split their attention. The radio crackled with static before Reynolds' voice came through. Package secure, holding position. Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of relief, knowing Melody was safely hidden. Now she just needed to keep the intruders distracted until help arrived. A shadow fell across the cabin door, seconds before it splintered under a powerful kick. Elizabeth pressed herself against the far wall as a man entered, tall, muscular, with the blank expression of a professional. "Ms. Evans," he said, his voice eerily calm, "you have something that doesn't belong to you." Elizabeth clutched the backpack tighter. "This belongs to Melody Coleman, who is under my family's legal protection." The man smiled without humor. "Mr. Hargrove would disagree. His niece and her belongings are his responsibility now." "Melody doesn't have an uncle," Elizabeth shot back. "Your employer is a liar and a criminal." Strong accusations. The man took a step forward. "I'm not here to debate ethics, Ms. Evans. Just hand over the backpack, and this gets no messier than it already is." Elizabeth's mind raced, calculating distances and angles, searching for any advantage. "And if I refuse?" "I'm authorized to use necessary force." His hand moved slightly, revealing the gun holstered at his hip. "Please don't make that necessary." The radio at Elizabeth's side crackled again, 3 short bursts followed by a long tone, the signal they'd agreed upon. Help was 3 minutes out. She just needed to stall. "Why does Globalife want this so badly?" she asked, gesturing with the backpack. "What are they hiding about those clinical trials?" Something flickered in the man's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she knew that much. "My job is retrieval, not explanation." "You're retrieving evidence of crimes against children," Elizabeth pressed. "Does that bother you at all? Or does Globalife pay enough to silence your conscience?" The man's expression hardened. "Last chance, Ms. Evans." The backpack. Elizabeth made a show of considering, then slowly extended the backpack toward him. As he reached for it, she suddenly flung it past him through the open door. The man instinctively turned, giving Elizabeth the moment she needed to dive sideways, rolling behind the cabin's small galley counter. The man recovered quickly, but the backpack now lay in the open doorway, creating a dilemma: secure Elizabeth or retrieve the prize. He chose the latter, scooping up the backpack and backing toward the door, gun now drawn and pointed at Elizabeth. "A valiant effort," he acknowledged, "but ultimately futile." As he turned to leave, a deafening roar split the air, the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors directly overhead. The man hesitated, clearly recalculating his odds. That moment of indecision was all Katerina needed. She appeared behind him like a ghost, the butt of her pistol connecting with the base of his skull with surgical precision. He crumpled to the floor, the backpack falling from his grasp. "Perfect timing," Katerina remarked, retrieving the backpack and handing it to Elizabeth. "Your grandfather's people are securing the rest of the yacht. It seems our unwelcome visitors are having second thoughts about their mission." Elizabeth sagged against the counter, adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. Melody? Safe. Reynolds is bringing her up now. Katerina glanced at the unconscious man at her feet. What shall we do with this one? Elizabeth considered the man who had been willing to threaten a child for corporate interests. Take him with us. I think the FBI will be very interested in what he has to say about Globalife's retrieval methods. The Swiss chalet nestled among snow-capped peaks looked more like a fortress than a vacation home. Stone walls 3 feet thick, bulletproof windows, and a security system that would make most government installations envious, all disguised beneath alpine charm and traditional architecture. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at sea. Noah had healed enough to travel, and was now happily exploring his new surroundings, his injury seemingly forgotten with the resilience of childhood. Melody had been quieter, watching the adults with solemn eyes that missed nothing. Elizabeth found the girl in the library, curled in a window seat with a book nearly as large as she was, a medical text from Charles's collection. Light reading? Elizabeth asked, settling beside her. Melody shrugged. I'm trying to understand what they did to those kids, the ones in Mum's notes. Elizabeth gently closed the book. That's not your responsibility, Melody. It feels like it is. The girl's voice was small but determined. Mom died trying to help them. Now it's up to me. No, Elizabeth corrected firmly. It's up to all of us. That's what family does. Shares burdens. Melody looked up sharply. Are we? Family? The question hung in the air between them, laden with hope and fear in equal measure. Before Elizabeth could answer, the library door opened. Charles entered, followed by a tall woman in a tailored suit, whom Elizabeth recognized as Diane Winters, the Evans family's chief legal counsel. Good news, Charles announced without preamble. The FBI has officially launched a full investigation into Globalife. The evidence from Sophia's journal was irrefutable. Melody sat up straighter. Will the bad people go to jail? Diane smiled gently at the girl. Some of them already have. Richard Hargrove was arrested this morning for conspiracy, fraud, and falsifying medical records. And the children from the trials? Elizabeth asked. Charles's expression sobered. We've identified 7 so far, all experiencing symptoms similar to what Sophia documented. Our medical foundation is arranging treatment. Melody nodded, absorbing this information with her usual gravity. What happens to me now? The adults exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Charles stepped forward, lowering himself somewhat stiffly to Melody's eye level, a gesture that clearly cost his dignity but seemed important to him. That, he said carefully, depends entirely on what you want, Melody. The girl's dark eyes widened slightly. What I want? Yes. Charles cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Elizabeth and I have discussed this at length. We would like, that is, if you're amenable, we would like to offer you a permanent home with us. You mean adopt me? Melody whispered, her voice barely audible. Precisely. Charles straightened his tie, a nervous gesture Elizabeth had rarely seen. The paperwork has been prepared, but of course nothing would proceed without your full agreement. For a moment, Melody sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Then, with a movement so swift it caught everyone by surprise, she launched herself at Charles, thin arms wrapping around his neck. The billionaire looked momentarily stunned before awkwardly returning the embrace, his usual composure completely abandoned. Is that a yes? He asked gruffly, emotion making his voice rougher than usual. Melody nodded against his shoulder, words temporarily beyond her. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes at the unlikely tableau, her stern, formidable grandfather brought to his knees by an 8-year-old's embrace. Diane discreetly wiped her own eyes. I'll file the paperwork immediately, she murmured, slipping quietly from the room. When Melody finally pulled back, her cheeks were wet, but her eyes were bright. "Does this mean I get to stay with Noah too?" "Of course," Elizabeth assured her. "He'd be lost without his miracle doctor." As if summoned by his name, Noah toddled into the library, clutching his favorite dinosaur toy. He made a beeline for Melody, climbing onto the window seat beside her with the complete confidence of a child who knows he is adored. "Melody, stay forever?" he asked hopefully, echoing his declaration from weeks earlier. Charles met Elizabeth's eyes over the children's heads, something soft and unfamiliar in his gaze. "Yes, Noah," he confirmed. "Melody stays forever." 6 months passed with remarkable tranquility. The Swiss chalet had become a true home, filled with the sounds of children's laughter, something the old house had never known in all its years, as a sterile showcase of Evan's wealth. Elizabeth stood on the terrace watching as Melody patiently taught Noah to build a snowman in the garden below. The girl had blossomed in recent months, gaining weight, height, and a confidence that transformed her from the wary street child they'd first encountered. Charles joined his granddaughter, a steaming mug in each hand. "Hot chocolate." "Melody insists it tastes better with cinnamon." "A girl of refined tastes," Elizabeth replied, accepting the drink with a smile. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children play. Noah had developed a fierce devotion to his older cousin, following her everywhere with puppy-like adoration. "The final sentencing is tomorrow," Charles said eventually. "Hargrove is expected to receive 20 years. Elizabeth nodded. "And the company?" "Bankruptcy proceedings continue. The stock is worthless now." Charles sipped his chocolate, looking remarkably unbothered by the destruction of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. "The settlement fund for the affected families has been established. Anonymous donor." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Very anonymous, I'm sure." Charles's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "The children will be taken care of. All of them." Below, Melody had helped Noah place a carrot nose on their snowman, the little boy's delighted squeal carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air. "Have you told her yet?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "About school?" "Not yet. I wanted to discuss the options with her together." Charles hesitated. "Do you think she'll be pleased?" The uncertainty in her grandfather's voice, this titan of industry seeking reassurance about an 8-year-old's opinion, still struck Elizabeth as remarkable. "Grandfather, you're offering her the chance to attend any school in the world, with tutors to help her catch up on what she's missed. Of course she'll be pleased." Charles nodded, though he looked unconvinced. "She's not an ordinary child, Elizabeth. Conventional paths may not suit her." As if to prove his point, Melody had abandoned the snowman project and was now examining something in the snow with scientific intensity, showing Noah how to use a magnifying glass she pulled from her pocket. "Always prepared," Charles murmured, watching her, "like a miniature field researcher." A chime from inside the house interrupted their observations, the secure communication system that connected them to the outside world while maintaining their privacy. Charles sighed. "That will be Whitfield with the weekly reports. Excuse me." Left alone, Elizabeth continued watching the children. The transformation in both of them over the past months had been remarkable. Noah's vocabulary had exploded, and his hearing remained perfect, a miracle that medical science couldn't fully explain. And Melody. Elizabeth smiled, remembering the girl's latest achievement, correcting her grandfather's math during a lesson on fractions. Charles had been stunned, then delighted by her quick mind. "Miss Elizabeth?" The butler's voice came from behind her. "There's a secure call for you, Mr. Alejandro Ruiz." Elizabeth felt a spike of concern. They hadn't heard from Alejandro since returning to Switzerland. "I'll take it in the study." Alejandro's face on the screen looked much as she remembered. Kind eyes in a weathered face, but there was a tension there that immediately put her on alert. Ms. Evans, I apologize for contacting you, but there's something you should know. He glanced nervously over his shoulder. I've been followed since the trial began, men watching my apartment, my workplace. Elizabeth felt cold that had nothing to do with the Alpine winter. Global Life Associates? I don't think so. They're different somehow, more professional. Alejandro lowered his voice. Yesterday, one of them approached me, asked about Melody, specifically about her helping Noah. What did you tell them? Nothing, but they knew things, Ms. Evans, things nobody should know. Fear flickered across his face. They mentioned the mud treatment, called it the miracle. They seemed very interested in how she knew what to do. Elizabeth burst into Charles's office without knocking, a breach of etiquette that would normally have earned a stern rebuke. Today, he merely looked up from his desk with raised eyebrows. We have a problem, she announced, quickly relaying Alejandro's warning. Charles listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. I feared this might happen, he said finally. Feared what might happen? Elizabeth demanded. Grandfather, what aren't you telling me? Charles sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. I've had our security team investigating Sophia Coleman's background since the beginning. There were inconsistencies. What kind of inconsistencies? Instead of answering directly, Charles pressed a button on his desk. A holographic display activated, showing a photograph of Sophia, a younger version than the one Elizabeth had seen in Melody's few possessions. This was taken 12 years ago at a research facility in Nevada, Charles explained. Sophia wasn't just a nurse, Elizabeth, she was a biochemist specializing in neuroplasticity. Elizabeth stared at the image, struggling to process this revelation. Why would she hide that? Because the research she was involved with was classified. Experimental treatments exploring human healing capabilities. Charles manipulated the display, showing more images, laboratory settings, medical equipment. The program was officially terminated 10 years ago, all records sealed. What does this have to do with Melody? Charles hesitated, clearly choosing his words with care. Have you noticed anything unusual about Melody's abilities, beyond her remarkable intelligence? Elizabeth thought of the mud treatment that had restored Noah's hearing when specialists had failed, of Melody's uncanny perceptiveness, her ability to understand complex concepts with minimal explanation. You think she's some kind of prodigy? Elizabeth asked. I think she's exactly what Global Life was trying to create with their illegal trials, Charles replied quietly. A child with enhanced healing abilities. But while they were experimenting on unwitting subjects, Sophia may have already perfected the process with her own daughter. The implication hung in the air, too fantastic to fully comprehend. That's why she was so protective of Melody, Elizabeth realized slowly. Not just because she was her mother, but because she knew what others might do if they discovered what Melody could do. Charles nodded grimly. And now, someone else has made the connection. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Children's voices raised in excitement. Elizabeth moved to the window in time to see Melody and Noah racing across the snow toward a small animal, a fox, limping badly on what appeared to be an injured leg. Grandfather, she said urgently, we need to get them inside, now. They reached the garden as Melody knelt beside the injured fox, which showed none of the usual fear a wild animal would display toward humans. Noah stood nearby, watching with wide eyes as Melody gently examined the creature's bleeding paw. It's okay, she was murmuring. I can help you. Melody, Charles called sharply. Step away from that animal. It could be dangerous. The girl looked up, her expression serene and focused in a way that seemed suddenly alien on her young face. It's not dangerous. It's hurt. I can fix it. Before either adult could intervene, Melody had placed her hands on the fox's injured leg. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, to Elizabeth's astonishment, the animal relaxed, its pained whimpering subsiding. When Melody removed her hands, the fox stood cautiously, testing its weight on the previously injured limb. It took one step, then another, seemingly healed. It regarded Melody for a long moment with intelligent eyes, then turned and trotted away into the trees. Noah clapped his hands in delight. "Melody fixed it like my ears." Charles and Elizabeth exchanged stunned glances. What they'd just witnessed defied rational explanation. Melody turned to them, her face suddenly pale and drawn, as if the effort had drained her. "I don't do it often," she said quietly. "Mum said not to let anyone see." But it was hurting so bad. Elizabeth moved forward, gathering the exhausted child in her arms. "It's all right, sweetheart, you're not in trouble." Over Melody's head, she met her grandfather's gaze, seeing in his eyes the same realization that was dawning on her. Their responsibility had just become far greater than simply providing a home for an orphaned child. They were now the protectors of a secret that could change the world, or put Melody in greater danger than they had ever imagined. 6 months later, the Evans family gathered on the terrace of their Boston home, enjoying the warm spring evening. Noah, now 3.5, chased fireflies across the lawn, while Melody sat at the table, intently focused on a complex puzzle Charles had given her. Elizabeth watched them with a contentment that still sometimes surprised her. The transition back to public life had been carefully managed. Charles had used his influence to ensure Melody's unique abilities remained private, known only to a trusted few. The Globalife scandal had faded from headlines, its executives serving prison terms while the victims received care through the Evans Foundation. The mysterious men who had approached Alejandro never reappeared, perhaps deterred by the increased security Charles had implemented around their extended family. Life had found a new normal, one that included specialized tutoring for Melody, who was absorbing knowledge at a rate that astonished even her teachers, and regular checkups with Dr. Reichman, who monitored her health with careful discretion. Charles joined them, setting down a tray of lemonade. "Puzzle proving challenging?" he asked Melody. She grinned up at him. "I solved it 10 minutes ago. I'm just seeing if there are alternative solutions." "Of course you are," he replied with proud exasperation. Noah abandoned his firefly hunt and clambered onto Elizabeth's lap. "Tell story, Auntie, the one about Melody and my ears." It had become his favorite bedtime request. The tale of how Melody had come into their lives, carefully edited for his young understanding. "Again?" Elizabeth pretended to groan. "Don't you ever get tired of that one?" "Never, ever," Noah insisted. Melody looked up from her puzzle, her dark eyes meeting Elizabeth's with shared amusement. At 9, she now bore little resemblance to the half-starved child they'd found outside the hospital. Her face had filled out, her once dull hair now shone with health, and the wariness in her eyes had been replaced by confidence. "I like that story too," she admitted with a smile. Charles settled into his chair, looking more relaxed than Elizabeth could ever remember seeing him. "Well then, by all means, Elizabeth. We're all eager to hear it again." As Elizabeth began the familiar tale, she watched Melody's face. The slight smile, the calm certainty, the absolute belonging. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever secrets still needed protecting, they would face them together. "Once upon a time," Elizabeth began, "there was a little boy who couldn't hear, and a little girl who could see what others couldn't." Noah snuggled closer, eyes wide with anticipation, despite knowing every word to come. Melody's smile deepened as she reached for Charles's hand across the table, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year ago. In the distance, a fox appeared at the edge of the garden, watching them with intelligent eyes. Melody noticed it and gave a small wave. The animal seemed to nod before disappearing back into the growing twilight. Some miracles, Elizabeth reflected, watching her unlikely family in the golden evening light, didn't need scientific explanation. They simply needed to be cherished. And that, she concluded, hugging Noah close as the story reached its familiar end, is how we became a family, not by blood, but by something much stronger, by choice, by love, and by a little bit of magic. And they all lived happily ever after, Noah prompted, following the script he knew by heart. Elizabeth met Melody's eyes, seeing in them the wisdom and hope that had drawn them together that rainy day outside the hospital. Not just happily ever after, Elizabeth amended, reaching out her free hand to Melody, who took it without hesitation, but bravely ever after. Because the best families aren't the ones that never face storms, they're the ones that weather them together.